Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. We are about to start the post-lunch session. We have Ahilan Kadirgamar in the chair. Thank you very much, Ahilan, for agreeing to chair this session. And we have three panelists. I will let Ahilan take it from there and take you through the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the panel on power, distributive justice, and the politics of post-war resource transfers. I've been asked to chair this session at the very kind of last minute because I think the previous chair could not make it. And also we have three speakers on the program. It says 4 speakers, but Anushka Wijesinha is ill, so he could not make it today. So we'll have some extra time as well. And as usual, these post-lunch sessions are a little difficult, but we have 3 very engaging papers. There's probably 2 reasons why I shouldn't be chairing this. One, because I myself haven't had the chance to read the papers fully. Secondly, in recent months, in a couple other sessions that I had organized, there were email responses saying, why are there 3 nondescript men? So I think all the feminists in the room should be happy. We have 3 women panelists. I should probably also not be here. And I'm sure they are not nondescript men or women. They are very well accomplished researchers. So we're going to start this session with Giulia Minoia, and the title of her paper is The Informal Regulation of the Onion Market in Nangarhar, Afghanistan. Giulia works for the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, where she is leading the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium team.
So this paper is part of a work in progress coming from fieldwork we conducted in Nangarhar between the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014. For those who are not familiar with Afghanistan, Nangarhar is part of the eastern provinces of the country. It is on the border with Pakistan, the so-called Durand Line, which is a soft border where you have all sorts of formal and informal trade coming through. And the Durand Line was created to have Afghanistan as a buffer between the British India and the Russian Empire. And so let's go back to our study. As I said, this is part of a series of studies that we are conducting in Afghanistan, basically to answer the question, how do rural people survive in Afghanistan? So we look at how the economic life is structured from the perspective of the social actors in the field, and we try to understand the complexity of these markets. Of course, one of our objectives is to engage with the donors community in Afghanistan so that they can design more effective policies. For example, one of the donors we engage with is the FID. And the FID is funding a program in Afghanistan which is called Comprehensive Agriculture and Rural Development Facility. The CARDEF program basically sustains that the lack of information on prices and the lack of access to credit is inhibiting farmers and small traders to take risks and access markets. And so how to support the growth of rural income through strengthening markets, through selected value chain production, so that we can combat the cultivation of opium poppy, which is quite popular in Afghanistan. So we decided to look at this specific market in order to highlight that there are other social dimensions which are actually embedded within the commodity markets. And one is related to the role of traders as setters of the terms of the trade, and the fact that the market exchanges are embedded in social relationships that are related to credit, social networks, and power structures. These power structures are both ruling the economic market as well as the political market. And we see in Nangarhar, for example, which is just an example for an Afghan province, that we have the same actors playing on both arenas. For example, this is a very well-known warlord. So what we did, basically 70 interviews between December 2013 and February 2014 with 21 traders in Jalalabad within the vegetable market, traders in Peshawar, so across the border with Pakistan, and some traders working at district level, so Sukrod, Rudat, Darinur, and Bisud are districts of Nangarhar, which are presenting different conditions in terms of security, geography, access to markets, and water distribution. And then we did a second round, again with the traders in both Jalalabad and Peshawar, and farmers. So why did we decide to focus on onions in Nangarhar? For a few reasons. The first is related to the fact that we were doing a study, a political analysis of Nangarhar, and so we thought it would be interesting to have an analysis coming from the market side and the political side. Nangarhar is very interesting, geographically speaking, because it has got a relatively low altitude for Afghanistan. The irrigation is reliable. So there is a good potential for agricultural growth. On the other side, it was interesting to look at onions because we have been noticing that after two relevant ban of opium poppy cultivation, the cultivation of onions has been spreading into the province. And actually the crop has been behaving pretty well, although there's no crop that can adapt to the harsh Afghan climate such as opium poppy does. There is another main reason that is related to the position of Jalalabad very close to the border with Pakistan, and it makes Jalalabad a hub between the two countries. And it's also interesting to notice that Afghans in Peshawar and Afghans in Jalalabad, being the majority from the Pashtun ethnicity, speak the same language and have very close cultural ties. So now I'll go a bit I'll zoom into the field and I'll describe the onion traders of Jalalabad. So basically the Sabji Mandi, which is the vegetable market of Jalalabad, is very interesting for if we look at the distribution of the space, meaning that we can see that space allocation is a representation of power. So we have this very big trader, which is the warlord I was showing before, which is also, of course, a businessman, that is owning basically half of the plot which is dedicated to the vegetable market. And then there are some key features which are characterizing this group of around 20-30 big traders in the Jalalabad market. They have been, all of them have been establishing their role within the last 10 years, so after the beginning of the war or after the Taliban left. They all have been in exile in Pakistan during the Russian invasion, so they all have been fighting as mujahideen. And they all prospered under Governor Sherzai, which was in power in Nangarhar after 2004, and he just left last October. One more thing very interesting to notice is that through their close relationship with Sherzai, they have been always very influential on the control over the border revenues. There are some other characteristics which are interesting to highlight. If we look at this group of traders in Jalalabad, and if we look at how the relationship between the districts and Jalalabad city works, and how these two are related to the rest of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we can notice that, for example, there are very, very strong links and trade networks between Jalalabad and Peshawar, so cross borders, and these are based on family relations, and they were established during the refugees' time. It's also interesting to notice that this elite of traders is maintaining control over price regulation, and there are exclusionary practices which are not allowing small traders working at district level to access the market. First, because they work on credit, so they are only a link between the big traders in Jalalabad and the farmers at district level. Second, because it wouldn't be profitable for them to access the market in Jalalabad, because the big traders are controlling prices. Moreover, the big traders control traffic at Torkham border through a very interesting but complicated system, like scaling system, so that they don't pay the extra weight they should pay. Another aspect that is not allowing small traders and farmers to take risks and access the market is related to the fact that the relationships between traders in Jalalabad, traders in Peshawar, and traders in the other provinces of Afghanistan are based on mutual trust. And there is collusion on the prices. So that, for example, even though a farmer has got, through technology, a farmer can have access to information, but if we think that the onions market is it's seasonal, so there are 8 months of exports from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and then 8 months of imports from Pakistan to Afghanistan. And the prices can fluctuate depending on the season, depending on crop failure, but the groups of people controlling the markets within Peshawar, Jalalabad, or the other market center, it's quite small. There is, however, an interesting example if we want to look at small examples from the field where people are actually managing to find strategies to actually access market and take risks. There is a small village in one of the districts in Nangarhar, which is which has got a very good production of onions in terms of quality. And there are actually small traders within this district that are managing to establish connections with traders in Kabul or in Peshawar and to become traders on their own. They do this through accumulation of capital that comes from smuggling other sorts of goods. But this is actually an example that tells that for some traders which are having favorable conditions and which are actually open to take risks, it is possible to escape these patronage relations with these elite traders in Jalalabad. On the other side, to wrap up, so what we notice is that the information on prices is available, but small traders and farmers cannot escape anyway from credit relations. And this group of traders is still maintaining control over import and export. They have a very interesting form of association that they call Itiadia, which in English would mean union. It's like a trader association, and there are around 50 members. And through this association, they can actually negotiate with the Chamber of Commerce in Kabul and in Nangarhar to have, let's say, they can negotiate on the border revenues, they can negotiate on how to access markets, external markets, international markets, and they manage to keep the traders at district level in a subordinated position. On the other side, there is this very interesting relation between the traders in Peshawar and the traders in Jalalabad, which are having, of course, the same language, the same culture. They have family members in both cities. But we have to notice that it's a Pakistani counterpart, which is usually representing the elite of the traders in the Peshawar market. So at the end, what we can see through this example of Nangarhar is that, yes, there are ways, like small example, where people can actually escape these social practices and social norms which are reproducing power structures. But these are very, very, very few, and the functioning and the social processes which are actually ruling the onions market in Nangarhar are embedded in these social structures of power.
Okay. Thank you, Giulia. That's very much on time. And the next speaker is Mareike Schomerus, and the title of her paper is Post-War Bureaucratization of Conflict, South Sudan's Resource Utilization System. She's a researcher based at the London School of Economics.
Thank you. Which one? Which microphone did you use? This one? This one? All of them? Oh wow, this is a true rock star moment. I feel like I'm at a press conference. Thank you very much for having me. It's really been truly wonderful for me to listen in the last couple of days and to link a lot of the debates on Asia to some of the things that I have learned specifically about South Sudan, where I have worked on and off for the last 10 years. So you see a little bit of some of these lessons that I think I've learned in a very, very complicated country in this presentation, or in this paper, which I'm writing with a colleague of mine from the LSE, with Hakan Seçkin-Elgin. So I just want to give you a tiny little bit of background on South Sudan, and this will be a real gallop through the history of South Sudan. But I'll start with the notion that in many ways, when people talk about South Sudan now, they kind of reframe history almost. And very often the history of South Sudan is now being talked about as if everything in the last almost 100 years was really a prolonged countdown, as if everything was always heading towards the moment of declaration of independence. And I think that's a really dangerous and also quite mistaken notion. It's really a recasting of history, which I think we need to keep in mind, this recasting, when I make some of the points that I will make later on. But just very, very briefly, the first rebellion within the southern Sudan happened before Sudan declared independence from Britain, although it wasn't technically a colony of Britain. It was administered as a condominium by Egypt and Britain together. And this first rebellion lasted until about 1972, when a peace agreement was signed. The years of that first rebellion, some of them were extremely quiet. There wasn't that much fighting. But a lot of the issues that came back in the Second Civil War were already on the table at the time. And the Second Civil War broke out as a rebellion in 1983, and that was the rebellion led by the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA, under John Garang. And this very much was, well, it ended, let's work backwards. It ended in 2005 with a peace agreement that was signed between the SPLA, then SPLA/M for Sudan People's Liberation Movement, to denote that there was a political wing to the armed rebellion as well, and the government in Khartoum. And it's important to keep in mind that this peace agreement, the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, was signed and negotiated with a lot of international support. And this international support also came about through the framing of a civil war that actually for a very long time wasn't particularly clearly framed. When the rebellion started, it wasn't clear what the political aims of these rebellions were to be. For a very long time, there wasn't a political movement. And in fact, there's a very famous saying in South Sudan that Dr. John, which is John Garang, carried his plans and his government in a briefcase, that it was only him who knew actually what he was trying to achieve. A lot of people would disagree with that, but that's a saying. But this, internationally, the civil war was very successfully framed, and that's still what you will encounter whenever you read a news article about the Sudanese war, that this was a war of the Christian South against the Muslim North. And every now and then, particularly in US-based media, you will also find mentioning of slavery, that the North regularly enslaved Southerners, and this was also a reason why there was a lot of resonance, particularly in the United States, in supporting the Southern cause. So it was very much this idea that this was, in a way, the perfect liberation, led by a rebel leader who was fighting very much the good war and who had a PhD from a United States university. What's important to keep in mind, and with this dream of the perfect liberation came some of the provisions in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. Because, of course, in the international community, very much attached to the dream of liberation is the dream of democracy. So some of these very obvious milestones of a Western idealized democracies are, of course, elections, and in this particular case, for South Sudan, also a referendum on self-determination. What's important to realize in this kind of reframing of the history or retelling of the history is that in reality there wasn't ever this prolonged countdown towards secessionism, because John Garang didn't openly fight for secessionism or for separation from Sudan. He had a vision that was summed up as New Sudan, which was the idea that everybody in Sudan would be better off under a united Sudan that was equal and that didn't marginalize particular groups of people. But this shifted very quickly much more towards a rhetoric of secessionism and independence, particularly after John Garang died in a very untimely air crash just briefly after the peace agreement was signed. And of course, then in 2011 brought the birth of what the South Sudanese very affectionately refer to as the birth of their baby nation. And internationally, this birth of the baby nation was very much seen as a success. This is almost as if this had always been, everything had been worked towards this achievement of independence from Sudan. And before I launch into a lot of very problematic points, I do also want to make clear that it's no doubt that the independence of South Sudan realized the dreams of many, many South Sudanese. Whether they actually got what they expected is a different story, and this is what we'll get to now. And I'll start from the events in December last year when violence broke out, and a lot of the dreams and hopes for South Sudan internationally as well as nationally were shattered. So in December, violence broke out which very quickly turned into a fully armed rebellion between, in a way, the government, which is represented on this picture by President Salva Kiir, there on the left, and his former vice president, Riek Machar, who very quickly became the leader of an armed rebellion. And if you read the framing of this particular violent period of South Sudanese history now, you see a lot of analysis is quite focused on a few causes. So one is very often this is a personal failure of leadership of these two political leaders. Another one that has become already very prominent is that South Sudan is a failed state. So a lot of the language that goes with that has been about. And the third one is that this is the reason behind this is irreconcilable ethnic differences, which is a very, very unhelpful framing of the conflict. So how strong some of these notions are about these causes of this particular period of violence, you can see in the proposed solutions from the international community. So, for example, one very prominent solution that's on the table is withdrawal of the two political leaders and elections in which they're not allowed to contest, and then reconciliation between groups. So all the very sort of common post-war rhetoric or solutions that we know. But I want to propose something very different. I don't want to say that none of these elements play a part in what has happened in South Sudan and what has happened in the last few years, but I want to make the claim that none of them accurately capture what has actually been going on and what we see as an overlooked systematic problem. So this is what we think. I think when we look at the history of South Sudan, we can say that coming out of a long, long period of war, the centralized war mechanisms that existed in the South became institutionalized in the post-war period as administrative structures. And this was very much done also through international interests, because the international interest or the commitment was very much to creating structures of a nation state. And so our main point is that what we see is a bureaucratization of South Sudan's warlike structures in post-war development. So to understand, actually this is I'm just a few little digression. It's a slippery slope because I'm going to suggest that, or I'll challenge Professor Luca's statement that institution building is needed, because my point would be that actually institutions have been built, quite successfully so. It's just the wrong kind of institutions for what people expected South Sudan to be. So to understand this bureaucratization, we took a particular look at how attitudes to social policies were shaped in South Sudan. And we look at it very much through the experience of South Sudanese citizens. How do those at the receiving end of these structures experience this bureaucratized war structure? So there are a few points I want to make about this. First of all, bureaucratization is such a big word. So for us, we look at it as a process of putting in structures that then the relationship between people and those in power. And that, of course, also as a knock-on effect in a way defines what social policies are like. So we look at a systematic relationship between the conflict, the bureaucratic impulse that comes from the conflict and from everything that happens afterwards, and the implications of moving from the context of war into the context of state formation, which we think is what has happened in South Sudan. And we frame this using two very well-known frameworks, which we call Shabal and Tilly Plus, because you have, of course, Shabal's and Dalos's work, and they look at disorder as a functioning system, rather than saying something is dysfunctional if it looks disorderly. Disorder actually offers opportunities. So states with the dependent bureaucracies actually function very well, even though they don't fit the Weberian state model. And one other point that they make that's very important is that in this seemingly disorder, administration is often personalized. And of course, a personalized administrative structure is very much at odds with the ideas of a modern state. And this space is then filled with the interests of particular elites. And then the other part of Shabal and Tilly Plus is, of course, Charles Tilly, who very controversially but also famously said that wars make states. And that this also means that war means that resources are controlled by power holders. And war also shapes attitudes to social policies. And war shapes how access to services is regulated by the army, because obviously the army or the armed group in charge of the war is very much a determining factor. So in a way, what we draw from Tilly is the kind of war you have determines the kind of peace you will get. And what we see in South Sudan is that the army during the war very much used service delivery to reward, also to punish, to reward loyalty and to punish lack of loyalty or lack of cooperation. And we see this continue now. So the interesting thing is, of course, we want to know what this experience of this process is like for the people of South Sudan. And in a way, you can already stumble about this, the people of South Sudan, because it's not necessarily very clear who they are. Of course, creating an administration means you have to establish a uniform target group, because otherwise, who are you going to administer? So the people of South Sudan need to theoretically exist as a unity or an entity to be governed. But despite the claim that the marginalized people of Sudan owned the CPA offered very little guidance on this, of how the people of South Sudan were to be defined. And there's an interesting tension between the lack of this definition and the very strong ownership narrative that you have and that helped carry South Sudan into independence, which is very much a narrative amongst the people that this is our country. What the CPA does, however, it doesn't tell you very much about who the people are, but it does very much establish the bureaucratization of structures. It laid out very clearly what had to happen in South Sudan. And it was, of course, formulated along international agreeable guidelines. The language is very kind of opportune to international lingo. That also meant, because of the time in which it was negotiated and it was written, that the existing powers were not challenged, or if at best to a very limited degree. Instead, the bureaucratization that's been laid out in the CPA mandated the existing powers, which of course were the warring parties once upon a time, to develop institutions according to what the CPA says they deem relevant. So in a way, it was sort of a self-referential process of bureaucratization that was very much put in place on paper. And of course, at the time, it would have been impossible to give that mandate of establishing institutions that were deemed relevant to anyone but the war actors, because, I mean, you can imagine why that would be the case. So, of course, you come into this with very strong military legacies. That is simply the reality of having fought a war and coming out of it with a peace agreement. And military legacies are very often looked at in a very narrow way, as if it's only about veterans and about what combatants did and where they would fit in the new political system. But we want to take a sort of more systematic step back and say, well, actually, we see a direct continuity between war and a post-war as a more appropriate consideration, rather than looking at very specific actors. We look at it in a more systematic way. So one way we see this very prominently is with the previously mentioned notion of reward and punishment, reward of loyalty and punishment of people who were not loyal very much. And one of the ways that this is expressed now by people when you talk to them is through this idea that the government is very actively punishing those who are not fully behind it right now. So this is a very typical quote that you can get really in all places in South Sudan, where the expectations of government were very, very different than what is being happening. But it's not just that the government hasn't delivered in people's understanding, it has purposely not delivered. There's a reason behind this. There's a system behind this. So this relationship of using services as reward and punishment has very much become the basis of what sort of on the surface appears to be a model modern state. And I just want to remind us that the international actors have a very strong part to play. And this I show you with this rather sad picture of empty flagpoles at the Joint Donor Office. Once upon a time, there were a lot of flags flying of European and US countries, and it's now a little bit sad. But the role of international political actors is really hugely important, and I think in the current very messy situation has been overlooked a little bit. Because in a way, international actors always came into this with an assumption of discontinuity, with the assumption that once a peace agreement was signed, the same actors would somehow discontinue the system that they had established. And that, of course, is a very fatal misassumption, because there isn't a particular reason for them to do that. It's not even necessarily out of bad will, but it's very hard to change. As we all know, it's very hard for anyone to change. And in addition, international actors saw the creation of the new state of South Sudan very much as, in a way, the ideal peaceful outcome, rather than as a continuation under a new flag. So we have a continuation of many ways of working that were established under the war. So what we're asking is, how does this framing allow us to understand some of the causes of the present conflict in South Sudan? So again, the formation of the new state and the institutionalization of this bureaucracy that comes along with this, on the one hand has become a source of legitimacy, of course. You have all of a sudden, you have a state government, you have a president, and international actors very much underpinned this legitimacy. But on the other hand, state formation replicated the power relations that were already there and that remained very much unchallenged. And the present conflict, I think, that we see is very much linked to this process and is linked to re-establishing ways of working that happened during the war. And the picture that I put up here is of a so-called ghost village. It was put up very quickly to pretend to international humanitarian actors that there were a lot more displaced people than there actually were. That was a very common strategy in many wars, and this picture actually wasn't taken during the war. It was taken in late 2010 when there was a lot of displacement due to the referendum. But it's a very strong symbol of how these ways of working have also worked as a very good resource extraction. We think that the way of engagement in a war has been, in a way, easier for a lot of actors, because the humanitarian actors, of course, find it much easier to intervene in a particular moment of crisis. In a way, international actors find it much easier to intervene when they can take a very clear stance, which is war and violence is bad. But in the very nitty-gritty, fine political processes that go on around that, they are often a lot more clumsy and a lot more unsure of themselves. And one of these very obvious processes in which international support was easily given was exactly during the elections, because they were seen as a milestone. And they, in reality, became a milestone between the sort of narrative of building the state and building these democratic rituals in the state and the reality of how this was experienced. So internationally, donors and observation missions, and for full disclosure, I was on one of these, so I'm just as guilty of this, continued support for the electoral process, and also afterwards didn't challenge it very much when it was very clear that it hadn't been a very good electoral process, but sort of waved it through and saying, well, we need to get to the referendum, so we'll just let this one pass. For local voters, the experience of election was a really very different one. The experience of the first elections that really everyone had ever experienced and which had been given to them as sort of the promised land of democracy were quite intimidating. So they had seen security forces in Pobus, they had seen very violent political contestation, and it was really a very kind of uncomfortable space for many people in which to move. And in a way, for them, it became exactly what had been warned before, a box-ticking exercise in a sort of democratic make-believe process that, in the end, helped to consolidate powers. And then we move into post-independent politics, and these, of course, were very prominently characterized by a struggle over extending and expanding presidential powers, and by a constitutional process that was a lot more exclusive than most people would have liked it to be. So if we look at these developments after independence through the lens of bureaucratization, we can also see that this process also consolidated resource allocation powers. And this was, of course, strengthened. This had been strengthened through the bureaucratized electoral process because it was very difficult to challenge a democratically elected government. So it was a very difficult situation there. So we saw two dislocations here in a way from the general discourse on South Sudan. One was internal to the pre-nation state and the warring groups and individuals, where those in power have used the new state as a justification to gain access to resources. And the second dislocation was about the bureaucratic imperatives really of a modern state and how it engages with its citizens. And what the citizens have found, that coming out of the war, they now face a very centralized and very powerful central government, which is not at all what they had expected. So one of the examples that we give in the paper is the centralization of the tax system, for example. So the tax system was centralized incidentally on advice of USAID, which puts the states, which were supposed to be the decentralized South Sudan, in a real bind, because on the one hand, they're expected to build infrastructure and they're expected to show that things are changing in peace, but on the other hand, they actually don't have power over the allocation of their own resources. And the second very confusing process that people see is that the South Sudanese war was very much fought with this idea of decentralization, of taking power away from the center. But what they're actually seeing now is that power is very much consolidated in a center, and that there's actually some deconcentration going on. So you have agencies that work in the states, but actually do report back to Juba. So we have we have several layers of legitimacy in which the government now operates. So one is based on the history of being involved in the war. And the second, this is very much people who don't feel that they've been part of this. This is a very typical quote for them. The second is that it's very much a legacy of the elections, which were really very painful for a lot of people. And they don't feel as if they have had any benefits from this electoral process. And the third one is simply the experiments of government actors. And this is very much summed up in this quote, that people expect something bad to come from Juba because that has been their experience. So to sum up, I was trying to reframe the current violence as a crisis, in a way as a crisis of the political economy of resource allocation in South Sudan, in post-war South Sudan. And my main point is that to highlight a need for a much broader understanding of these processes, and one lens that helps, I think, is the lens of distributive justice. And in this we can include the points that I made earlier, the interest of international actors, which were very committed to establishing state structures and maybe too readily prepared to simply put these state structures on top of what already existed. And with that, they helped, we argue, nudge along a system that in a way made change almost impossible and continuation of a war very likely. Because now what we see is a very bureaucratized structure of these warlike structures. So rather than looking at everything that happens in South Sudan now as a struggle of political power, and certainly as a personalized struggle of political power, I would say it's a struggle of distributive justice. And understanding this better and maybe trying to adjust it would be a precursor, possibly, to a more peaceful South Sudan. And maybe, and I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on this, maybe this is also an understanding that would help in looking at post-war development in other contexts. So thank you.
And our third speaker is Vanessa van der Boogard, and the title of her paper is The Pervasiveness and Relative Popularity of Informal Taxation in Post-Conflict Sierra Leone. Vanessa is a research officer with the International Center for Tax and Development and a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto.
Okay, a lot of microphones here. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I would also like to express my gratitude to all the SIPA staff that have been working so hard, not just this week, but I know over several months to make this happen and to make it happen so smoothly. And a final note of thanks to the translators that have been working exceptionally hard over the last couple days, and whom I'm very, very impressed with. And a preemptive apology to them if I get excited and start to speak too quickly. So I'm going to talk today about taxation and development in conflict-affected contexts. I think that when we talk about post-war development, an important element to think about is how services are delivered, how those services are funded, and how the different modalities of revenue collection affect both the distribution of services and tax burdens, and the subsequent implications for relationships or lack thereof between citizens and the state. In thinking about these issues in conflict-affected contexts, it's also important to recognize that in these areas, and particularly when we're talking about areas outside of major urban centers, taxpayers, citizens pay a wide range of payments, a wide range of taxes to a wide range of actors that often exist outside of a statutorily mandated tax framework. I'm going to talk about some of these payments today in the context of Sierra Leone, where I've conducted research on behalf of the International Center for Tax and Development with Samuel Jabao, who is a researcher based in Freetown, and with Wilson Pritchard, who is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And I'll also briefly note that we planned and implemented this research on informal taxation in Sierra Leone in close partnership with the SLRC and the NCCR with Bishnu and his team, in the hope that future research along this agenda will allow for cross-country comparison on informal taxation. So I guess before I really get into the research that we did, I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding about what I mean by informal taxation. As you probably are all imagining, that encompasses a wide range of payments that citizens make to both state and non-state actors. So when we're talking about state informal taxation, that can mean things like bribes, extortion, payments made at military or police checkpoints, or goodwill payments to state officials, or acceleration fees for service delivery. And then on the other hand, when we're talking about informal non-state taxation, these types of payments are generally conceived as existing somewhere along a spectrum of coercion and quasi-voluntary payment. In reality, they often fall somewhere in between. But when we're talking about the coercive end of that spectrum, that can mean things like payments made to vigilante groups, to warlords, to neighborhood watch groups, security groups. So it often means things like protection payments in insecure areas. On the more quasi-voluntary side of that spectrum, these payments often mean things like community levies made to, again, a range of actors. That can be made to NGOs, to chiefs and traditional authorities, to religious groups, or to local elites. So I recognize that our definition of informal taxation is broad, but I assure you that it is intentionally broad, as our aim with this research was to capture the full range of payments citizens make in these areas in order to better understand the basis of post-conflict taxation, service delivery, as well as to understand the fairness of distribution and local governance and decentralization more broadly. So just to give you an idea of where I'm going to go in this presentation, I'll first just briefly go over the methods we used in this research, provide a little bit of background about decentralized governance and taxation in Sierra Leone. We'll review some of our key findings from the most recent round of this research, and then discuss implications for how we think about post-conflict taxation and service delivery. So the core of this research is based on a taxpayer survey that reached over 1,100 taxpayers in the eastern part of Sierra Leone, across 3 districts, with districts being the highest level of local government in Sierra Leone. We complemented these surveys with interviews with local government officials and chiefdom authorities, as well as other governing authorities in these communities. And we held focus group discussions with a range of actors in each community, reflecting a cross-section of community interests. So I've just highlighted here the 3 districts where we conducted this research, Konadugu, Kono, and Kailan. All 3 were heavily conflict affected during the Civil War from 1991 to 2002. They're all relatively rural and relatively isolated from the state. With these characteristics, we expect informal taxation to be higher in these areas, while also expecting the prevalence of informal taxation here to be different than it would be in urban centers or in the western parts of the country closer to Freetown. Just in terms of a brief background, I'm not going to get too much into the background of governance and decentralization in Sierra Leone. Sorry. That was on. I just want to highlight 2 key points that are relevant to our understanding of informal taxation in these areas. So first, it's important to realize that the local government system that exists in Sierra Leone was only established in 2004, and it remains, as you could well imagine, in the early stages of institutional development. In some areas, this institutional weakness has left room for informal governance and service delivery, both as a means of self-help to provide services amongst communities, and also as a form or through semi-exploitative practices. The second key point to highlight is the role of chiefs in tax collection in Sierra Leone, where they hold a significant amount of power, of informal power, and are actually responsible for collecting a range of key local taxes on behalf of local districts, even though chiefdoms are not recognized as a formal level of government. So we'll get to our key findings. Let me just note here that we differentiate between formal state taxes, informal state taxes, meaning bribes to state officials or payments made at military or police checkpoints, chiefdom taxes, and those are exclusive of taxes paid to chiefs on behalf of local governments. So that can mean things like labor payments made to chiefs for community projects, but also for private farms or whatever it may be in the different contexts. And then we also, our fourth category is informal non-state taxes. Overall, we find a wide range of actors involved in revenue mobilization and service provision at the local level, and a high degree of institutionalization of non-state delivery in these areas. Respondents reported paying a greater number of informal taxes than formal taxes, with almost half of all taxes paid being non-statutory payments made to a chief or a non-state actor. In terms of taxpayer perceptions of these different types of taxes, we find first that taxpayers are more likely to perceive the rate of taxation to be too high for taxes levied by the government, while respondents were also more likely to find taxes levied by chiefs or non-state actors to be reasonable, with some respondents even willing to pay a higher rate. At the same time, formal and informal state taxes are perceived to have almost equally unfair rates, though taxpayers also perceive formal state taxes to be more fairly applied and collected and more evenly distributed amongst the tax-paying population than informal taxes. And just to note, these are just summaries of our responses from the surveys. In terms of transparency, we find that looking at tax rate setting and of information sharing about how revenues from the taxes are spent within the communities, informal non-state taxes are perceived by taxpayers to be the most transparent of all taxes, with informal chiefdom taxes viewed more positively than formal or informal state taxes as well. Our third point is looking at fiscal exchange. So when we asked taxpayers what they received in return for paying taxes, respondents were much more likely to report receiving a good or a service, a tangible good or a service, in exchange for paying informal non-state or chiefdom taxes, relative to both formal and informal state taxes. And finally, we find that taxpayers believe that informal non-state and chiefdom taxes are more likely than formal or informal state taxes to be used to benefit the community some or most of the time. So when we're thinking about implications of these findings about taxpayer perceptions of the different types of tax, I'm going to highlight 4 key points. So first, we found our findings that we highlighted included that informal taxes, including those levied by non-state actors, are a really prevalent reality in these rural areas of conflict-affected Sierra Leone. Now, as you can imagine, this has implications simply for how we think about taxation and service delivery in these areas from both an academic and a policy perspective. Given the significance of informal tax at the local level, I really think it's necessary to widen our analytic lens to more frequently capture the full range of taxes paid by citizens in order for us to understand the real systems of tax and governance that exist, as well as their effect on both poverty and livelihoods. Second, as I noted, informal non-state and chiefdom taxes are more positively perceived across a range of indicators relative to taxes levied by the state, with informal non-state taxes perceived to be the most fair, reciprocal, transparent, and accountable of all taxes. This seems to indicate relatively effective and consensual forms of informal tax collection and service delivery at the community levels in the absence of effective state service delivery. This raises questions about how we think about service delivery methods in the aftermath of conflict, and seems to suggest some advantages of community-driven development models. Though, as we discussed today, there are, earlier today, there are well-documented risks associated with these models, including the risk of strengthening local institutions that may be unaccountable or unrepresentative. More fundamentally, though, I think there's also a risk of privatizing service delivery in areas or in ways that create parallel service delivery systems or tax systems to the state in a manner that doesn't serve to strengthen the underlying relationship between the taxpayer and the state, which may be particularly relevant in post-conflict areas. My third point is about informal chiefdom taxes. It may be less transferable to other contexts, as it is quite unique to this system of chiefdom institutions in Sierra Leone. But just to reiterate that we found that chiefdom taxes perform better than state taxes, are perceived to perform better than state taxes by citizens. While we also found, particularly through our qualitative research, that local governments remain highly dependent on chiefs in order to collect the most basic of taxes. But at the same time, citizens were more likely to perceive chiefdom taxes as relatively unaccountable and lacking in transparency. This paradox provides insights which require further research. Thank you. But hopefully we can contribute to a broader discussion about the need to find institutional strategies that recognize the reality of chiefs' prominence in these areas, but don't give carte blanche for unaccountability. And finally, we find that formal state taxes levied by both the central and the local government perform really poorly in the eyes of citizens. This implies a basic need to increase taxpayer confidence in the formal system, and as well as to explore what that may mean to citizens. Our evidence suggests that taxpayers overwhelmingly believe that they get nothing in return for the taxes they pay to the local government, which suggests a need to think about how we can go about addressing this, including providing tangible benefits for taxes and increasing the transparency and accountability of the current system. So that is the research. I will highlight, though, that it is at an early stage. It's part of an ongoing research project on informal taxation in Sierra Leone. So I would be really happy to get your perspectives and insights in terms of what you think may be missing from the research, where you think we could push it forward, and how it may relate to contexts that I'm less familiar with in Asia and Africa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all three speakers. And we have plenty of time for discussion. So this is how I'd propose that we move forward with the discussion. We almost have an hour. Maybe the first round of questions, and comments and so on, let's focus on the 3 papers. And then I'd like to propose, I think because we have plenty of time, maybe also, a large part of the audience more engaged here in Sri Lanka. We also, whether it's possible to relate some of these issues also to kind of our context here in Sri Lanka or to other areas. But maybe we start with what's been presented. And so if you can, if you want to ask much more broader comments and so on, I suggest you keep it for the second round. Maybe I'll collect 5, 6 comments, questions at a time. And maybe, as you're thinking, I'll start with just maybe one question to each of the speakers. To Giulia, the traders that you mentioned also across Afghanistan and Pakistan, what are the asymmetries like? I mean, you mentioned that there are these networks, but is there any kind of, are the traders on the Pakistan side much more powerful? And also what's happening in terms of capital accumulation, right? So whatever that, they're able to fix the market, they're able to have high returns, but what happens to it? Where does it then end up? If you have some idea of that, I'd be interested in that. And to Mareike, maybe you could kind of clarify more about, you mentioned kind of the international actors, they are concerned about building democratic state structures and so on, but what about the interests of the international actors? What's the geopolitics of South Sudan? I think that'll be interesting for us to have a sense of. And Vanessa, I was wondering if you could maybe clarify, where does, for example, how would you relate, for example, like usurious interest, like very high interest loans and so on that also are almost kind of extortive, right? Whether that would also fall into informal taxes or not, and and how we think of this kind of extraction, which isn't necessarily that part of the informal taxes that doesn't go into any kind of services, but it's more extortive. But anyway, those are just some questions I'd like to put on the table, but let's take a round of questions.
Oh, thank you.
And if you can introduce yourself, please, and ask a question.
I'm David from a state that extracts lots of taxes, the Canadian state. So to try and get a comparative framework here, and if you want to push it to Sri Lanka, maybe that would be interesting too. So would the three of you kind of give a characterization of what sort of state you see emerging? We could have a warlord state. I mean, warlords exercise coercion. They have semi-bureaucratic organizational structures. They have armies, so on. So what's emerging there? And how does it extract resources from from the people? And in Sudan, and what sort of taxation processes are going on in South Sudan? And I think Vanessa, by calling chiefs non-state, I'd say it's another kind of state. It's a different mode of production and social relations. So we're not really. It's a different kind of status. Out of the purvey of a Weberian state, maybe. But so kind of think about that. And what are the services that your taxpayers are getting? So you're kind of saying, yeah, they like what the chiefs do, but what do they actually get? What's the local state supposed to deliver? What's the central state supposed to deliver? And across, from Giulia, we have an indication of resistance or counter strategies by the small traders. But the other two, maybe, do we see forms of resistance against an accumulating elite, or what sort of state is extracting resources from them? Do we see organizations? In Zimbabwe, Vanessa and I were talking about the informal traders who are being taxed informally by police 4 times a day, $4 a day, American dollars, with people who are earning maybe $8 a day if they're really, really, really lucky. So they have organized a union of informal traders trying to negotiate with the state, whatever it is, to have the police lay off and maybe just pay $1 a day in taxes. So you were talking about informal ways of tax collection, but is there an informal sector that you can identify, and how is it relating to this variegated, unevenly articulated state that's emerging across these post-war situations? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anam Khan from Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Pakistan. So I have a question, Vanessa. When we're speaking of the definition of informal taxation, especially in relation to livelihoods, what I think is, because you guys have a broad definition, but I think it's not broad enough, because did you guys think of including the excludability and inaccessibility as an informal tax as well? Like, for example, like in Giulia's presentation, she was saying the small traders cannot access the markets because of excludability and because of all it is like a tax for them, because, you know, it's like an informal tax for them as well, because it's costing them in their businesses. So did you guys try and capture that somewhere in the paper?
Hi, Paul Harvey. First of all, wow, there were 3 really, really good presentations, and so thank you for that. This is just a plug. Vanessa sort of mentioned it briefly, but we've done the same survey with NCCR in Nepal, with findings on that forthcoming, and when they do arrive, it will be really fascinating to sort of contrast and compare the findings between the 2 contexts.
Yeah, I just want to echo again, I think quite interesting findings. Maybe I want to raise some few questions about, especially for Giulia, it has been seen over time how markets manage to survive during war, and becoming even a platform for not only for the market, but even for other things, even becoming a platform for conflict resolution, community level. What are you seeing in the case of Afghanistan? To what level the market started surviving or become creative in the conflict before you go for the post-conflict period? I think for Mareike, my question is really, there's a debate always when you have peace agreement between population census and elections. And then sometimes it is becoming a prerequisite for the population, become prerequisite for elections. But in a situation like Southern Sudan, given the fact that dominance of the SPLM liberation movement, to what level can we ensure check and balance and a democratic institutions emerging in such a situation? Given the fact, even though you go for election, you will know that the SPLM is going to win and is going to monopolize the whole thing. But how can we ensure in such setting a democratic space in such a situation? Vanessa, I really like your thing, because what you are saying actually coming from a lot of and I think the point I want to highlight is the issue of the traditional institutions. And in most cases, there's a lot of debate whether they have been weakened during war, and they have been surviving. And in actual fact, it's becoming even, when you look for the delivery of services, people tend to look at leave alone in terms of taxes, but becoming a mediating channel through which between whether it's a provider of service, whether being UN or international community or NGOs, and then the people. Because it seems to be an institution that is very, the implication of your work is going even further than this one, the importance of these, which could we talk about even becoming a mediating, a bridge between the providers of the services and the people.
Thank you. I'm Di Silva from Colombo. Actually, to begin with, the presentations are very comprehensive, and I think I should thank them. My question is, I know under difficult conditions, it is very difficult to do this kind of research and ascertain what is going on. My question is, basically, from where is this capital coming from? It was mentioned that the capital is raised through informal ways like smuggling and, or maybe extortions, I don't know. Where is the beginning? How does it get into circulation? And the other thing is, what is the currency used? In a scenario like this, you have a kind of a stress to other kinds of currencies which are strong in the market, like dollars. Is it the local currency which is being used, or is it something like a dollar or any other currency? The other question is, when you say informal means it is not formalized. So do these governments take any measures to make it formalized so that the money is properly circulated, so that the government also benefits in the process, so that it's back or reintegrated into the system? Then also on the other side, coming on with the small producers, what is the backing that they have to get on with their farming especially? Is there any microfinance or any kind of microfinancial assistance given to these people? If you could answer, it probably shows up what's going on at that level. Thank you.
Have a round of maybe responses, and then we'll have another round of questions and comments.
So, to start with this Afghan-Pakistan trade, I have to clarify that this study was a qualitative case study aiming at understanding the onions market within Nangarhar. So we decided to look at Peshawar because it was from what we have been told by the traders in Jalalabad, their counterparts in Peshawar were Afghans. And that to us was interesting because it was meaning that actually the refugee status somehow has been a plus in order to establish networks and trade connections. It's interesting, I think, to say that, for example, the currency in Nangarhar is not the Afghani, but it's the Pakistani rupee. And talking about let's say the traders, the elite traders in Peshawar, in Pakistan, we have to say that these are not Afghans. These are Pakistani from Punjab. On the capital accumulation, what we have been told by traders in Jalalabad is that actually they do reinvest everything in buying new stocks. We didn't ask the same questions to the Punjabi traders. But it's interesting also because Pakistani traders are the link between Afghan traders and whatever, it could be Dubai or India. But Afghan traders are always trading with India or Dubai through credit that comes from Pakistan. So that's I don't know if it clarifies a bit the picture.
So my first question, the question to me was, what's the geopolitical interest that international actors had in building democratic state structures in South Sudan? The very obvious answer that you would get probably in most arguments would be, of course, there's oil in South Sudan. I don't necessarily say you can completely disregard the oil presence, because I'm sure it played a role, but I'm also sure that it's not the only role. And I really can't stress enough how powerful some of these development narratives are for international actors, how powerful it is to be supporting sort of the liberation movement against an oppressor that is so universally considered to be a really bad oppressor, and where it really seemingly seems to be putting things into their right place. So that was really, particularly from the Bush administration, who of course featured quite prominently in the peace negotiations, that was really a very strong narrative that can't be disregarded. So in a way, the geopolitical interest, I think, might have come secondary to the ideologies that were hidden behind this, and which also facilitated in many ways the sort of pulling the wool over their own eyes when things weren't going quite as they should have gone according to this democratic template. A second question was, what sort of taxation processes are going on in South Sudan? That's an interesting question, of course, exactly for this resource allocation mechanisms that we talk about in greater detail in the paper. So obviously on the national level you have the formal taxes, which were once upon a time thought to be extracted at state level, because I mean a lot of the rhetoric around the civil war was very much about decentralization, or rather the centralization of power and resources in the government in Khartoum. And so the notions of the margin and periphery are really very strong. So in the very beginning, it was the idea was that the states would hold a lot more power. But as I mentioned before, on international advice and maybe also on manageability, this was sort of reversed when it comes to the national taxes. But what that means is that, first of all, the idea of decentralization has gone very much out of the window, unsurprisingly so, since it's very hard to decentralize something that wasn't ever central in the first place. So it's kind of a bit of a roundabout process that was proposed there. But the second knock-on effect of that is that you have all sorts of local taxes that are very similar to taxes that would have been extracted during the war. So you have a lot of, particularly on the borders, specific army units would extract their own tax if you want to cross, if you want to bring in certain goods and so on. So there's a lot of the resource mechanisms that were very firmly established during the war, and they continue to this day, which of course again sort of underscores our argument that some of these things have now been officially bureaucratized in a way, because there's a realization that the flawless tax system in which everything sort of in an ordered manner trickles down to the states, and the states then are accountable upwards, is not going to happen anytime soon. What forms of resistance are emerging against the state? I mean, that's an interesting question, because of course some people would argue that the armed resistance that you see now is a form of resistance. Others would argue that actually the armed violence at the moment is just two versions of the states trying to get the bigger cake of power. But there is a much stronger debate about federalism, even though theoretically it is already a decentralized country, but the federalism debate has become very strong, sometimes to the point that certain areas say we actually have no need to stay with South Sudan, we can break away. So that's heating up a lot. And the other form of resistance, of course, that you have individual groups that take over state functions, and with that take over state entitlements. And the very obvious one there is, of course, protection. So you have groups that provide civilian protection, and with that comes an entitlement, again, also to tax, of course. So that's in a way working under, with, and against the state at the same time in a very confusing way. Professor Luca's question about the population census and elections, yeah, this is really an interesting thing to think about, because it's, in a way, it's such a symbol of how establishing these democratic milestones in a peace agreement like this can't really possibly work. Because what happened, I think, in South Sudan was the population was always a prerequisite for the elections. There hadn't been a population census for a very long time, in some parts never. And then the elections were seen as a prerequisite for the referendum on self-determinations, because the idea was that only a legitimately elected government could then carry South Sudan through this referendum, rather than a government that came into power through a peace agreement and a power-sharing agreement. So on paper, again, that looks like a very linear process towards democracy. In reality, the population census was, as you know, very hard to really carry out. And because it was seen as a precursor to elections, people who had electoral interest very much made it one. So, of course, population census, it was very much manipulated according to where you wanted constituents to be that then would vote for you, or there would be a vote emerging from these constituents that had shown up in the population census. So the second part of the question was, how can the democratic space emerge in the situation where, in a way, the election winner is already clear? I think for South Sudan, that's an extremely interesting question, because you have a contradiction that exists in parallel. So on the one hand, you have people who are extremely disillusioned, as you've seen from some of the quotes that I showed you, extremely disillusioned with the government and the SPLM. But on the other hand, the SPLM brand is incredibly important. And even people who are very disillusioned and very critical of the government very often would say, ultimately we will still vote for them, because ultimately that's what we are. It's not even so much that they're our party, but we are the SPLM. South Sudan is the SPLM. So with that sort of contradiction in parallel, of course, also comes a great political responsibility for the SPLM, I would suggest, where maybe the idea to put the democratic development on paper with these 3 milestones, I think, has been proven to be absurd, because that's also not how political processes happen. But maybe another way to think about this is that the political space needs to emerge without a necessary first step towards power contestation. So in a way, I often try to think about South Sudan as something that pushes us to redefine how we think about a lot of processes. And this particular one, I think, would be a good thing to think about political contestation without necessarily leadership contestation, but actually trying to have a debate or establish a space for debate, a space for opinions and what kind of state and what kind of country South Sudan ought to be, without necessarily challenging the leadership. Because in a way, that's the kind of process that people would be more comfortable with, I think, because the leadership is seen very critically, but also at the same time is very firmly established in people's mind as the leadership. Maybe just one. Sorry.
Thank you. So thank you first for Ahilan for your first question. I mean, I can sum up very briefly that we did not include extortionary loans as a type of tax, primarily for the reason that it would be difficult to do so. And coming from a tax analysis background and working with academics that focus primarily on formal taxes, we struggle to even include things like user fees within our survey when we're talking about taxes. And a lot of the other non-state taxes that we're looking at, it's pushing the boundaries of a technical definition of a tax. But I think you're right to highlight that, especially as we're wanting to look at the impact on livelihoods. So I think that there would certainly be value in exploring that and exploring that impact. And I mean, I can note that within our survey, we didn't just ask about taxes. We were also doing a household expenditure analysis to look at how the amount of taxes people are paying compare to their household expenditures. And that included things like loans. So when we get to that stage, we may be able to compare or maybe include that in a broader discussion in terms of the tax, in terms of the overall impact of expenditures for households. And just another sort of interesting point that came out within our survey, we were asking about loans that people had taken out generally, but then also specifically in order to pay a tax. And it ended up that I think it was about a fifth of our sample had done so within the past year, had taken out a loan specifically in order to pay a tax. So, I mean, I think that you're right that it's a really important issue to look at. Thank you to David as well. I think that you're very right to highlight that chiefs are their own form of governance. And I mean, we do differentiate between taxes levied by chiefs and taxes levied by non-state actors for that very reason, for the reason that certainly when you're looking at a very young local government system, we're not going in with the perspective that nothing existed there before 2004, as certainly there has been a long and rich history of these governing structures that function and function well, but maybe not in a Weberian context. So recognizing that they are their own structures of governance. In terms of the services received by taxpayers, I mean, it varies a lot. When we're looking at formal state taxes, that means basic things like education and health. But a lot of what we found within the areas where we're doing this research is that you have people that may be paying user fees for health and education, but then you also have people that are paying informal taxes directly to teachers and to doctors or nurses, just in order to either see a doctor or nurse or to attend the school. And I mean, that then ties into what we're looking at in terms of informal non-state taxation, because then you have teachers that are working at public schools, but that are not, they haven't been certified and they're not on government payroll. And in the areas where we're looking, that was actually the vast majority of teachers. So then the communities would get together and come up with ways in order to pay the teachers either on based on an annual or semester-based form of taxation. So of course then that only affects households that have children in school, but it was still a significant portion of the people we were looking at. When you're also looking at informal state taxes, that doesn't just mean user fees, but we're also capturing payments that people make when they cross military checkpoints. So you can see from one perspective that they're receiving a service in order to, in being able to pass, right? And of course that's a very generous perspective of what a service is. But if people are trying to get to the market and they have to pay this tax to pass, then it may be the tax that they have to pay to get to the market. And that applies as well when you're looking at payments that people make in terms of acceleration fees for documents, if they're trying to, especially in the cross-border situation, if they're trying to get across the border and have to either to pay to speed up the processing of their documents, though this often becomes an institutionalized reality for everyone. Whether you want it to be fast or not, then that just becomes the reality that these acceleration fees have to be paid no matter how quickly you get them back. Looking at informal chiefdom taxes, and again, those are exclusive of the taxes that the chiefs are collecting on behalf of the local governments. That often means things like, it can mean things like community development projects, so chiefs may be funding very basic services like water wells or boreholes in these areas where the government hasn't done so. And it also often means paying for the maintenance of development projects that have been introduced however many years ago by often an international NGO. So yeah, and in terms of informal non-state taxes then, I mean, that can also mean community development projects where groups will come together to provide services that are accessible to a certain number of people, certain defined number of people. And it can also mean user fees to alternative health centers and schools. So thank you as well to Anam for her points on whether to count exclusion as a tax. And I think that's, again, a really important point to make and to consider. It's something that would be very difficult to capture within our survey, but is something that we have considered within our qualitative interviews, when we were able to try to map out some of the power structures within these communities. Within the survey itself, which was quite long, where we captured a wide range of payments. How we went about doing that was surveying the head of household of the randomly selected households, and asking about the payments that they had made in the previous year. So looking at something like exclusion to a market would be difficult with that sample, only because it captured a range of different livelihoods, and these people had many different jobs. But we were able, within our qualitative interviews then, to kind of get at those underlying power dimensions. And it's something that we're still exploring and will require us to go back into the field to explore. But I think that you're right, that it's a really important area to complement the research on just the quantitative data we have.
I didn't answer David's question and Dr. Lucas' question. So on the warlords, I mean, is Afghanistan a state of warlords? I think the paper that my colleague Ashley Jackson wrote on the political governance of Nangarhar would probably better answer your question. But I can say that I don't know if Afghanistan is a state of warlords. It is sure that strong power holders or power brokers are ruling provinces in Afghanistan and are having influence on what is going on in Kabul, in the setup of the government. On the extraction of resources, I think what happened in Afghanistan has been that through the past 10 years, there has been a bureaucratization of warlords. So warlords were able to extract resources that were coming into the countries and the provincial reconstruction teams in a legal way. So they were elected provincial governors, chief of police, and through these bureaucratic roles, they were able to access resources and extract resources. Of course, they do have control and they do extract resources from, for example, the border police. But I think the real step that has been taken in Afghanistan, and the decision was made by the international community, was to put in place those men as representative of the government in the provinces. And on markets in post-conflict or conflict, and if like where the area where this study has been done has been, for example, changing in terms of security within the last few months. So now it would be absolutely impossible to go there and do field work, for example. So I don't see like these examples of success in surviving and becoming small traders and being able to trade, avoiding these patronage structures. I don't see it as a strategy that could I see more as a coping tactique, which is actually produced by very, very few actors. I think the main obstacle to the creation, for example, of community-led projects or activities related to access to markets is, on one side, violence or security. So if the violence is widespread, and there's no security for farmers, as it is happening now, they will go back to grow opium, which doesn't require labor, and it's very easy to sell, rather than risking their lives to grow whatever crop it could be. So, and on the other side, we have no protection from the state at all. So no price protection, no property rights. So right now, I don't see, there are some very, very, very small niches where you see that a small community in a favorable situation, because usually it's close to roads, close to markets, with a relatively good security. So in those areas, you could see some examples of community-led market activity, but I don't see it happening.
Thank you, sorry. I just wanted to respond to Dr. Luca's comment about traditional institutions as mediators of service. I think that's really important to highlight, and is exactly what we see in Sierra Leone, where chiefs are the go-between between not just local governments, even though they are collecting taxes on behalf of local governments, but also with any NGO groups or outside groups that come in. In Sierra Leone, it becomes a bit more complicated, though, as chiefs have been criticized for a long time, starting before the war, during the war, and continuing to be criticized for lack of accountability within their chiefdoms and by their subjects within the chiefdoms. And this is something that we found as well. Certainly the taxes that chiefdoms are collecting on behalf of local government aren't necessarily being remitted to local government. Chiefdoms are supposed to be remitting 40% of those taxes and keeping the rest for their administration. It's often the case that they don't remit anything. And this has created, as you can imagine, significant tension between the chiefdoms and the local governments who are trying to initiate a relationship with taxpayers and attempting to strengthen their position within these areas. And you can see now that in the districts where we did the research, local governments are now trying to introduce property tax for the first time and have decided to collect that tax on their own. That in itself has created tensions, but there's another layer to it, because chiefs still have the power to block the local governments from taxing citizens in their chiefdoms. And that differs from chiefdom to chiefdom, but we certainly see that happening in areas where chiefdoms retain a significant degree of autonomy, and that's primarily in chiefdoms that have lots of diamond wealth or that are really rural in some of the border areas.
Okay, so I think we'll start another round of comments, and now we'll broaden the discussion a bit to maybe also I normally shy away from any kind of comparisons because I think we lose the kind of grounding, but maybe we can abstract a bit and think about some of the questions. And maybe I'll start off with a couple comments and hopefully a lot of you can add in there too. I want to make a connection to what David said yesterday, right, about soldiers, merchants, and sages, because I think, I'm not sure where the sages fit into this, but definitely the soldiers and merchants are very much there in all three papers here. But it also seems to be about, the theme of the conference being about post-war development. In some ways, it's also about war-making, state-making, and development. And I want to kind of refer to Mareike's paper and the reference to Charles Tilley, because a lot of the things that are being discussed here, they're kind of deja vu for some of us in Sri Lanka, particularly because I remember in 2005 a DFID-sponsored document referred to Charles Tilley and mentioned that the LTT is that kind of an actor. But then many of us, I remember looking at Charles Tilley briefly and then seeing that, well, Tilley is talking about 16th, 17th century Europe and the emergence of states. And in a much more different world where there are many more global connections, whether that kind of an analogy could be used in the Sri Lankan context. Or what you just now mentioned in terms of that it's not just geopolitical interests as in oil, because a lot of people are also looking at when there was much international interest in Sri Lanka in 2002 around a very internationalized peace process. What are the interests? Is there oil in the Mannar Basin, or is there some major fish stock, or what is the interest here that suddenly the international actors are interested? But on the other hand, it was kind of I think some of us saw it as the kind of way in which international blueprints arrive and the power of that kind of discourse. So in the Sri Lankan case, it was soon after September 11th, 2001, and the war on terror. And a year later, Bush made the speech that there are two things. There is the war on terror, and it creates, and it's a war against terrorists, but terrorists are fed by failed states. So the other side to the war on terror is failed states. The part of the mission of the war on terror is to go and fix the failed states. And that was again brought here in one of the donor documents, that we have the Sri Lankan state, which could be seen at that point, which didn't have territorial control of the whole country, so therefore a failed state, and we have, quote unquote, a terrorist organization, and the role of donors was to bring about some kind of a negotiation between these two armed actors. And also that kind of a peace process it was combined with neoliberal reforms, so a major aid package that also looked at $4.5 billion at the Tokyo Donor Conference in 2003, which is huge for Sri Lanka, which said if the peace process makes gains along with all kinds of neoliberal reforms, that kind of aid was also linked to it. So there are different interests in terms of how these blueprints come in this move from war making to state making. But of course, in Sri Lanka, it took a very different route. And similarly, like this, I think the other issue that's become common in many of these countries that we're looking at in terms of kind of after the war context or during the war, are the problems along borders, right? This kind of much more porous borders. And even after the war, those, I think, it continues to create problems. So, Giulia was talking about trade, and maybe tomorrow we'll be hopefully exploring what's been happening in terms of the Pork Bay fisheries conflict between India and Sri Lanka. And because you have two sovereign countries, it's much more harder to solve the problems between the Sri Lankan fishers and Indian trawlers. On the Indian side, the small-scale fishers and the Indian trawlers were able to negotiate some kind of a deal. Whether it's right or wrong is another question. But here, because they both return to other shores, there are two sub-border. I think this is something that comes up over and over again. And then in your paper also about this kind of dual systems of governance, right, that the professor there was referring to. In the case of Sri Lanka also, for the period of the war, we had, in the north at least, there was the educational institutions, the hospitals, they were all supported by the Sri Lankan state. At the same time, the LTT ran its own institutions, and it also levied taxes, extortion, however you... So there were these parallel kind of administrations, one more militarized because it had territorial control, that were continuing. But then what happens at the end of the war to these two systems, right? How do they get integrated? And I think in some ways in the Sri Lankan context, the vacuum created by the LTT is also filled by militarization by the state and a certain militarization of other administrative institutions also take place. So there are some parallels, but I want to just open this up for a more broader discussion. We'll go to Vijay and then come back here. Mike, please, over there.
Thank you. I think there were three very important presentations. Giulia's paper underlines, I think, the importance of going beyond simplistic solutions like the reasons why traders can't access markets is because they don't have information, but actually that they're embedded in certain relationships of power, and that therefore the barriers are structural, and the fact that you need a political economy kind of view rather than simply looking at them as all engaged in some transactional relationships that are that just need to be fixed by providing more information. I think that's the standard approach, but I think recentering a political economy approach is the message that I get, and I think that's, you do elaborate that in your full paper, though you didn't so much touch upon the presentation. The second thing I want to make is I think both your presentation and Mareike's presentation, and also actually Vanessa's for that matter, took me back to all the emphasis on institutionalization that Aisha was laying on yesterday. And here we see all kinds of institutionalization, which you critique as bureaucratization. And I think it only underlines the kind of fragility of that discourse of building institutions, and somehow building institutions is going to lead us to resolve certain issues. But actually, when they sit, what do those institutions sit on? Whether in Sierra Leone in terms of taxation, or in South Sudan in terms of resources or markets. And what is interesting is even the market, so-called free market, sits on those structures of power. So even that institution actually is not, we need to bring power in all the time. And that's why, in a sense, the session said power, distributive justice, because I think that's the question. The power thing is what often gets missed. I think it's, in a sense, a very good response to Aisha. Also in the question of extraction and extortion, I think that's something which we haven't really focused on, and I think this panel brings that up really strongly, that it's not just about distribution or redistribution, it's actually about dealing with extraction and extortion. And the other thing, of course, that it flags is the informal sector, which, when we talk about development, that whole world of informality, in which so many large parts of, how labor and capital are kind of caught in, and circulate in that informality. I think that's something which we really need to focus a lot more, and I don't think we've spoken about it enough. I just had one very big concern. Vanessa, when you say informal tax and when you say acceleration fees, it just sounds like aestheticized corruption. Why are we aestheticizing corruption? I don't understand why are we calling it acceleration fees. Where is that coming from? This discourse, where is that coming from? I'm very intrigued by it, because why are we not calling it corruption? Or why are we not calling it bribe? Is there some, I actually quickly Googled up to see, what, because I was really curious, and I haven't read them, but the first few hits were World Bank hits. I don't know, that may just be Google. I'm not saying it's to do with the bank, but I just think there's an issue there. I think we should reflect on. And why I'm also curious to know why you all have embraced that. And I think that's a serious question because there's a reason, I mean, taxation has a distribution element to it or a redistribution element to it. Whereas the reason why we call corruption is because it's just extortion, it's extraction. And power works in a different way. So maybe I just felt that a bit troubled actually by this stylized kind of labeling.
Shall I go ahead? Shall I go ahead? Yeah? Yeah. Hi, I'm Dolly, and I'm a social anthropologist from the University of Stockholm. And I think this is an excellent panel, and just on taxes, the market, and resources, we really need another conference in itself. A panel is not enough, because this is at the heart of not only post-conflict societies, but also helps us to, I think, really extend the conversation to the process of colonization. And I think the era of decolonization, because if we are talking about taxation, we just can't, I think, narrow it down to post-conflict period. And I say this as somebody who comes from a region which has witnessed South Asia's longest insurgency, that is the armed conflict between the Naga insurgents and the government of India. My grandfather's generation paid tax, my mother's generation paid tax, and my generation pays tax, which is called a national taxation system, but not to the government of India, to the insurgents. And I think this is relevant to a lot of places around the world, including Sri Lanka. So my question is, I think, to Vanessa. I was wondering, when you have these categories, are you only emphasizing on monetary taxation, or are there other kinds of taxation that we can emphasize on? And it reminds me of Europe, E.P. Thompson's work, for example, right? What is theft? What is taxation? What is extortion? And I think that relates to Vijay's comments. If we say it's corruption in South Asia, maybe it's something else in Africa. And this is an excellent forum to brainstorm about this and also learn the languages that donors and governments use across continents. Then it's also related to, I think, a second question that I was wondering, and I think Vanessa would like to explain this a little bit about research, which is such a fascinating topic on tax. Did you all consider in your research taking into consideration about the multi-layered practices of sovereignty, right? And allegiances that social groups pay to. Maybe non-state actors are not non-state actors after all. Maybe they are recognized as a form of authority and really as a sovereign body in that particular context. It's very complex, but I would like to hear a little bit on that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Harsh. I'm from Bangalore. I actually had a very similar question to what Vijay just brought up on this acceleration phase, which I think that the question covers. It just reminded me that I'm flying back in a low-cost airline. But I also had a question to Mareike, and just to satisfy sort of this notion within the East African political ideology spectrum, following Meles Zenawi, Museveni, Kagame. And even when you speak to insiders, you get this sense that, we need to take care of the people, the party needs to take care of the people cannot take care of themselves, we cannot let this go, we're doing this for you, and there's this very strong, inbuilt, passionate belief of the party. Now, I haven't studied the SPLM, I haven't studied South Sudan, but I'm curious of how, is there sort of a trend here of sorts, conceptually at least, with South Sudan?
Hi, thank you. I have a question for Giulia, and I'm kind of asking this question, which is a bit broader than your specific presentation. But since we have you here, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the donors are actually doing in Afghanistan, and a quick mapping of who are the donors, what are they actually trying to achieve, what are the objectives, and some of their activities. Thank you.
Shall we? Yeah, because we only have a few minutes. So probably not long responses, but I'd like to give the panel a chance to respond, maybe brief responses, and then the rest maybe continue it over tea.
Yeah, sure. So I think that your question on what the donors are doing in Afghanistan is very much related to Vijay's comment on like how to look at markets in Afghanistan through a political economy lens. So, like, I'm a sociologist, I'm not an economist. But in Afghanistan, donors work basically on a provincial base. So we have the FAID, which is working in Helmand, which is working in Nangarhar. We have the Germans, which are working in the north. We have the Americans, which are working in the south. The donors' intervention, other than World Bank and the European Commission or the European Union, it's very much related to the intervention of the armies, so where the armies were located in terms of national belonging. What we see, for example, in relation to what DFID is doing in this specific context, is actually, if we think of what they're doing, so they intervene in very, let's say, in some confined areas where they support through the Afghan ministries for rural rehabilitation and development. They support small-scale projects trying to work on the construction of value chain and to build markets within the province. The point is that where they intervene in areas which are poppy-free, or this is what they state, and where there is relative stability in terms of violence and security, access to roads and access to markets. So these are areas which are in a way already secured or already under a process of development, or at least non-violence, because I think that in Afghanistan the point is that in some areas, if we want to look at markets, how can we look at markets in the same way in areas where we still have a war going on, rather than in areas where there is a stable condition, or where people are not exposed to daily violence? So we end up, thinking of power and how local elites are extracting resources, and how power is managed by local elites, and how local elites are both representing the political governance as well as the market governance. And this is working through informal regulation, if we look at commodity markets at provincial level. So, and we have cases in the districts, for example, we can have cases of success that we can call like small entrepreneurship. But then, and this is what actually the donors are doing, because this is also the direction that the European Union is taking. So let's, through the World Bank and through the Ministry of Rehabilitation and Development. Okay. So let's fund these small groups. Let's try to help small farmers to become entrepreneurs and to export dry fruits, nuts, and apricots to Dubai.
Giulia, I think we have to... We're running out of time.
I'm sorry. Yeah. No, I wanted to say this. So the choice of the donors seem to be to concentrate of small niches which are promising. So to say, like David Chandler was talking yesterday about like organic examples that donors can plus up, and this is what is happening. But then what is going on, and I'm not saying, I mean, they should do something different because this seems to be the trend, but then what is happening in the rest of the country?
Okay, we really have to wrap up, so maybe if you really have something pressing to say, because...
I'm very quick,
okay.
I promise. I have 3 very quick things to say. One, I was asked about geopolitics, and I forgot the war on terror. Shame on me, because of course the war on terror played a huge part in support for South Sudan, because of course North Sudan was declared by the US government as a harbor of terrorists, and one of the many, many things that were dangled in front of North Sudan's nose was always by the Americans to withdraw a trade embargo with that. Border controlling. Another interesting thing about South Sudan is that the state isn't able to control its territories, including what you would always see as the definition of state control, its borders. So I wrote another paper with a colleague on exactly this, that actually the way the South Sudanese state is emerging is to control through absence and to allow local contestation and state replacement, which is what we're seeing. I disagree with the East African trend, because I think the SPLM's in a way, great specialty, and that's what you see now, was decentralization, because they were never able to control everything, and it was a lot more local manifestations of things. So I think they're a very unique case.
Okay. Well, thank you for raising that point, Vijay. I realize that I may often start to work within my own bubble and forget how terminology is perceived by people that aren't with me in that bubble. The terminology that I used within the presentation, that we used within the paper, is not from an academic literature, but was actually from the respondents themselves. We had pilot tested our survey in order to know what sort of taxes we should be asking about. And these are how these taxes, these payments, are referred to by the local citizens. When we're talking about acceleration fees, and when we're talking about when they're crossing military checkpoints and they're making what may reasonably be called bribes, they're referred to as goodwill payments or cold water. And when we dug into that a little bit with respondents, we found that these payments aren't often perceived by taxpayers as corruption. In certain cases, we even find the existence of moral economies of corruption, where people are making these payments to state officials, but don't see it with the negative connotation that we may. Instead, they're seeing it as helping to support state officials whose salaries may not have been paid in the past year. So they're seeing it as they themselves it becomes this reciprocal relationship between the taxpayer and the state official, where they're both benefiting from something. And I just want to say that we use that terminology because we wanted to come in with a very non-normative perspective about the systems that exist. Especially with this stage of research, we're just attempting to capture the systems of governance and tax that exist. So we used what's there without providing too much of a critique. And just I want to respond to Dolly very quickly. I mean, we can talk about this further. We did capture non-monetary forms of taxation, both in kind and labor. As you can imagine, that created challenges in terms of how we quantify that, as we were capturing tax expenditures as well. But I mean, that's kind of getting into the weeds of methodology, and we can discuss that further. In terms of the multiple levels of sovereignty, I think that that's right, and that's a really interesting frame or lens through which we can perceive taxation in these areas, particularly with respect to chiefdoms, where the relationship between taxpayers and chiefdoms and taxpayers and states has been set up almost as they've been set up as competing sovereignties. So the chiefdoms and the governments are competing for power in these areas, and it's something we predominantly see in border areas as well, where communities may have no allegiance to the national government, and often in the areas where we're working, people don't speak the Sierra Leonean dialect of Creole. They're using Liberian dollars, and they, don't have that connection to the national government.
Okay, thanks again to all three panelists. I think we go for a shorter tea break and come back at 4:30, right? Thank you.